What's up, legends, and welcome back to my Unmatched Strategy Guide series. Before we begin with the normal video, I'd just like to say, hey, it's been a while. It's good to see you back here. And secondly, I want to just plug some other content creators from the Unmatched community. Three accounts that have sprung up relatively recently are Unmatched Board Game Fan, underscores included, on Instagram, and here on YouTube, Unmatched After Action Reports and Zero Skater 12. All three of these accounts are just super awesome things to exist. Weird way to say it, but the Instagram account has a lot of hero-specific tips just compiled together from certain community members. I know I contribute to a few of them. Unmatched After Action Reports posts like 20-minute playthroughs with commentary on it, which is much more digestible than the hour and a half video I released about a month ago. And Zero Skater 12, he was one of the commentators for the community tournament that happened. I want to say like last year, but it was probably like 2 months ago. Anyways, that man is like an encyclopedia of unmatched knowledge. He recently posted a tier list video, which I agree with for the most part. He didn't rank my Raptors very high, which brings tears to my eyes, but I completely understand. His tier list was much better than mine. It was also real. So yeah, anyways, links to all three of these channels or accounts, I guess, in terms of the Instagram one, will be in the description below. So after this video, or whenever you decide to click away, go subscribe or follow all of them. They all post relatively similar content to me, so if you like my videos, I'm sure you will like theirs, and it's always good to support other members of the community. Anyway, Dracula is the topic of this video. Let's get into the stats, and oh boy, I can already tell from the screen something's wrong. Alright, I pounded my computer and the image fixed. Anyway, Dracula is a melee hero with 13 health. His sidekicks, the sisters, now I'm not sure if they're actually his sisters or just sisters themselves, not related to Dracula. Anyway, they're also melee fighters, and there's 3 of them. They each have 1 health since there's multiple of them, and all together they have a move value of 2. Move 2 heroes are at an innate disadvantage because they're pretty slow. Dracula, however, doesn't really need to fly all over the board like Sinbad does because he doesn't attack very often. He just has a few really good attacks. So you just need to land a couple of them, and it does the same thing as some other heroes attacking much more frequently. In addition to mobility cards like Thirst for Sustenance and Dash, he also has Mistform, which is one of the best, if not the best, movement scheme in the game. So you definitely have nowhere to hide from Dracula, and whenever he wants to, he can just pop up right next to you. He doesn't even need to maneuver for that. So the move 2 value doesn't really disadvantage him that much. And because of your ability, you want your enemies coming to you. So you're not really going to be the aggressor in most situations. So movement and speed isn't really that much of an issue for you. It's certainly just bad that you can only move 2 spaces, but like every hero that has a move value of 2 suffers from that. 13 hero HP is the current minimum. I say current because, as we all know, Deadpool is coming out hopefully in July, and he only has 10 max health, but he isn't officially released yet, so currently 13 health is the minimum. Dracula shares this value with Alice and Robin Hood, and I will point out that while all 3 of them have very low max health, they all have something to kind of offset that. Like Alice has healing and the small defense bonus. Dracula has a ton of healing, and Robin Hood is just really hard to hit. Both he and Dracula have a bunch of sidekicks that they'll just hide behind, and hits on their sidekick don't hurt their health. So like I mentioned, you have pretty good healing. You can probably heal anywhere from like 6 to 8 health points per game, like relatively safely, which artificially increases your max health to like 19, 20. That's obviously not how it works. You're recovering health, not adding onto your max health, but like throughout the entire game, you might have unconcurrently like 20 health points, which is actually pretty good. You just have to be able to actually play your healing cards and not die before you get to draw them. The total health pool of 16 points is still pretty bad. The average is like 20, but I think Dracula's in like the bottom 4 or 5 heroes in terms of total health. He's 1 hit point short of Muldoon and Robin Hood, who are some other multi-sidekick heroes, and you're even or above the level of solo heroes like the Invisible Man. I think Jekyll and Hyde has 16 points, but Bruce Lee also has less health than you. So that's like the tier of health pool people that you're around. You are an all melee team. This is interesting because the other multi-sidekick teams, their heroes are ranged, talking about Medusa, Muldoon, and Robin Hood. So those heroes, I mentioned this in the Medusa video and very much in the Robin Hood video, like to just hide behind their sidekicks so that their hero doesn't take any damage. In order to actually hit your opponents as Dracula, you have to come out of your protective wall or meat shield or whatever you want to call it, and be adjacent to your opponent to actually hit them with a melee attack. So you work a little bit differently than the other multi-sidekick heroes do. In terms of deck composition, you have 13 unique cards, which is about average, but I will say most of your good cards, with the exception of Ravening Seduction, come in pairs, not triplets, which is a downside because you have 2 copies of your good cards instead of 3, but also in terms of consistency, there might be some games where you just like don't draw your Mistforms, and that makes your Beastforms harder to land, but there's a bunch of examples like that. We're actually going to do a deep dive into Dracula's deck composition after his ability, because there are a lot of interesting things I want to point out to you that affect how he plays and like what the significance of the certain card distributions is. So for his ability, it says, at the start of your turn, you may deal 1 damage to a fighter adjacent to Dracula. If you do, draw a card. So this is kind of similar to a bunch of other heroes' abilities. It deals 1 damage and draws a card like Muldoon's ability does. It deals 1 damage like Medusa's ability does, and it draws cards like Bigfoot and Angels does. So it's kind of like an amalgamation of a bunch of stuff, but at the same time it's entirely new. The start of turn timing, however, is pretty bad. As I mentioned in the Bigfoot video, Bigfoot gets to draw a card at the end of his turn, which is really good because that means he gets to control it and basically gets to draw a card on demand whenever he wants. At the start of your turn, however, that means that you have to sit through your opponent's entire turn before you can use the ability. So often your opponent, if they don't want you to draw a card and deal them a damage, of course, they just won't let you. So this ability, while like pretty good, as we'll see in a second, it is kind of unreliable. However, if you can get a pin with Dracula and some of his sisters, this ability is actually really good, because if your opponent fails to escape the pin on their turn, you get this, and you will get it at the start of every turn until they break the pin, which makes pinning your opponent as Dracula like a pretty good strategy, because your ability gives you cards so you can attack instead of maneuvering, but it's pretty deadly for them too because it deals damage. The adjacency requirement is really hard to get against ranged heroes, and Bruce Lee, who while a melee fighter, his ability lets him move 1 space at the end of his turn, so he'll just like never let you use this basically. It's pretty hard to land against them, which means in some matchups against ranged heroes, you just might not get this ability. Like your opponent just like won't really give you the chance to use it, and that kind of sucks. But against most melee fighters, you should be hitting this like 3 to 5 times a game, hopefully. The damage and a card at the same time is pretty good, because your goal at the beginning of the game is to chip away at your opponent's health so you can hit them with a really big attack, Beastform, later in the game. And drawing a card also helps too, because Beastform requires cards to be big. So this speeds up Beastform in terms of both the cards you need to fuel and the health total you need to reduce your opponent to before you can actually kill them with one of those. So it's pretty good. Now notice how it says deal 1 damage to a fighter adjacent to Dracula. It doesn't say opposing fighter like Medusa's ability does. This means if a sister was adjacent to you at the start of your turn, you could use this on your sister to kill them because they only have 1 health, but you'd get to draw a card, which I think you really should only do like if you like need to draw a block card or like you need another point of damage to end the game. It's a really niche circumstance, but just be aware that it is possible. So now the aforementioned deck comp deep dive. If you can see on the screen, the different colors and the numbers corresponding to the colors show how many attacks, versatiles, pure block cards, I guess they're just called block cards, and schemes Dracula has in his deck. And this is courtesy of the Unmatched database, which I include in the description of all my videos. So 17 total attack cards, or cards you can attack with, is actually the second lowest in the game right now. And Invisible Man has 16. Invisible Man is very not aggressive with his attacks, as we found in the last video. So this means that like you're relatively on that same level as him. 12 total block cards, or cards you can block with, is tied for second lowest with Beowulf, who also has 12, and the Raptors, who have 10. Now, interesting thing to point out is that the Raptors are probably the most aggressive deck in the game right now, and Beowulf is pretty aggressive too. So you have the block cards of aggressive decks, but the attack cards of a very non-aggressive deck, which I think is an interesting contradiction to point out. The fact that you don't really have a lot of block cards means that you're probably going to have to use your versatile cards on defense to block, so you'll have even less possible attacks. And the significance of not really having a lot of attacks is that your big card, like Beastform, if you're not really attacking a lot all game, your opponent can save their feints for your big attack, because if you're not attacking all game, they have less things to spend their feints on, which is a downside because that means that you don't really have a lot of cards to use as baits for your opponent's feints, because you have to spend those cards as block cards. So there's a lot of careful card management you have to do as Dracula, as seen here. And 9 schemes is actually tied for the most. Sherlock Holmes also has 9. And really all the Cobble and Fog heroes are, I'm pretty sure, are like the top 4 or 5 for schemes, because schemes made a big appearance in that set. And we'll talk about that more during the set summary. And the reason why this is important is because with 9 attacks, as in red cards, and 9 schemes, you have 18 cards you can't block with, which means that if you just have a bad shuffle of your deck, or your opponent is really aggressive and attacks you a lot, you'll just run out of cards to block with, or there'll just be sections in your deck where you're drawing cards and you just don't get any blues or purples or anything you can block with, which can potentially wreck you because you only have 13 health. So there really isn't a lot of room for error in that situation, because if your opponent knows you don't have a lot of block cards, they will continue to attack you, and your health total isn't very big. So the game won't last very long if you don't draw anything like that. And on top of that, your block cards aren't very high in value. You have 2 value 4s, I think 5 or 4 value 3s. I don't remember if you have 2 or 3 copies of Dash. I think it's 3 after saying that out loud. 3 feints, and you have Look Into My Eyes, which could be a value 5, could be a value 1. You'll never really know. So your black cards aren't actually that good anyways. You have to rely on them because that's what's in the deck. So with all that in mind, just keep that in mind. I just said that twice. Let's move on to the cards. The first card is, oh, there's another Fury of Dracula card in here. All right, whatever. I just gotta. Okay, whatever. Okay, it changed. Beastform is a 6 value Dracula only attack with a boost value of 4 and 2 copies. And it says, during combat, you may discard any number of cards from your hand. This card's value is +1 for each card you discard. First thing to point out, this is a 6 value attack, just like Larger Than Life and Excalibur are, except this has text, which if this doesn't scare you or pop out as a really good card, you need to just reevaluate your life at this point, I guess. Basically, you're like boosting this card, except each card you discard has a boost value of 1 regardless of whatever's printed on it. And if that didn't help you understand this card better, you can just ignore that. It probably made it worse. But let's just say you have a full hand of 7 cards, one of them being Beastform, and you attack your opponent. You can discard any of the other 6 cards in your hand, and Beastform will increase in value by 1 for each card you discard. So if you discard 6 cards, this card will be a value 12 attack, which is insane. It's ridiculous. If you use your ability at the start of your turn with a full hand, you'll have 8 cards. And if you then maneuver first action for 9 cards, you can then dump the other 8 cards. And 6 plus 8 is 14. And unblocked, that could kill like 4 or 5. I don't know the exact number, but that could kill a lot of characters like at full health. That is crazy. I say like good block cards are value 4. So that would deal 10 damage. That's like an unblocked Gaze of Stone, which is crazy. You can do crazy things with this card. Of course, that being said, those 2 examples are assuming that you discard your entire hand, which if you discard your entire hand and don't kill your opponent, they'll probably double attack you and they'll take out a lot of your health. So you can avoid this downside by using Beastform to end the game, because then it really doesn't matter how many cards you discard. In order to like always seem like a threat as Dracula, you pretty much want to keep your hand full a lot, so that your opponent, there's always that thought in the back of their mind that, oh god, if I end my turn next to Dracula, like, is he gonna hit me with a huge Beastform? Like, they'll always be doubting their decision to go in and attack you, because they'll be afraid of getting walloped for 8 damage. So a lot of times on your turn, you're pretty happy with double maneuvering, because that will maintain the size of your hand and always keep you as a threat. Now, you only have 2 copies of this. Restoration Games definitely learned their lesson. They saw 1 copy of Excalibur was too inconsistent and just like not good enough, and 3 copies of Larger Than Life was probably a little bit much. So they were like, you know what? 3rd tries the charm. We're going to give Dracula 2 copies of this and see what happens. And that gives you a little bit of margin for error, because if 1 Beastform gets fainted, yeah, it still dealt 4 damage, but this is like your big lethal finisher, and you probably want to end the game with this card. So it sucks when it gets fainted, but you have 2 copies of them, and as you'll see later, you potentially have some ways to get rid of your opponent's feints. And if you can do that before attacking with this card, you'll know that if the opponent's best block card is a 4, you can calculate how many cards you need in your hand to be able to kill them. A pretty common scenario is reducing your opponent's health to 8, so that even if both beast forms get fainted, you'll still pretty much be guaranteed to kill them. This is probably one of the top 3 attacks in Unmatched. You could make an argument that Forever Hide is better than this, and maybe make an argument that Larger Than Life is better just because there's 3 copies, but this might be, it really could be the best attack in all of Unmatched. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this card in the comment section below, but this is basically where Dracula gets all of his strength from. This is his big, bad, lethal attack, and boy is it scary to go against a Dracula with a full hand. The next card is Feeding Frenzy. How many times before this gets old? Anyways, Feeding Frenzy is a 2-value Dracula attack with a boost value of 3 and 2 copies. And it says, during combat, this card's value is +1 for each sister in the same zone as the opposing fighter. Now, I made the instant connection to Epic Poem from Beowulf's deck, because that was like, you gain a rage now, and this card's value is +1 for each rage you currently have. I think Epic Poem is a bit better, because having sidekicks in the same zone as the opposing fighter might be pretty telegraphed, because your opponent will always be able to see when you put down your attack card. They can always count and see how many sisters are in my zone right now. So if Dracula plays a Feeding Frenzy, like what could the potential attack be? Which means it's not very surprising, because they can always predict what it's going to be if you were to play it, and then play a defense card accordingly. However, something you can do is that you can purposely attack an enemy after you like move your sisters into their zone to kind of fake out playing this card. But then I thought about that more, and I realized this is like probably one of the weakest attacks in your deck. There's no point in faking them out with a Feeding Frenzy and then playing Ambush. Really, if you're trying to draw out a feint, you should play something like a Dash or an Exploit. I don't know. I think the whole problem with this card is that it gets worse as the game goes on because you're going to lose sisters. The sisters are pretty key for Dracula in terms of scheme damage early game. So most of the time, your opponent's probably going to be pretty aggressive about taking them out because, as you'll see later, you don't really have that many good block options for them, which in my opinion, like if you don't draw this within like the first 10-ish cards of the game, it's just like not very good. If you have all 3 sisters on the board, it's a 5 value attack, and that's actually pretty good. With 2, it's okay at 4, and with 1 or none, a 3 value attack with like no additional effect because the effect makes it a 3 value, or just a 2 value attack with no text, like just isn't very good. So at that point it becomes a bait card for a feint because you'd rather this get feinted than a Beastform. If you can land this in the early game and maybe deal 1 or 2 damage, it'll just make the rest of the game a little bit easier. But I definitely like this really isn't in my game plan when I'm trying to calculate how much damage I need to kill my opponent, just because it's so unreliable, and if you draw it late in the game, it's basically worthless. So it basically boils down to being a bait card, essentially, in my opinion. The next card is Do My Bidding, a Dracula-only block card with a value of 3, a boost value of 3, and 2 copies. It says, immediately, return your opponent's attack card to their hand. Look at their hand and choose an attack or versatile card for them to play. It may be the same card. So this is kind of like a forced discard from your opponent, where like some other people have this, like Sherlock, where you get to look at your opponent's hand and choose a card for them to discard. Except they're not discarding the card, they're playing it against you in combat, and you're blocking with a value 3 card. Defensive immediatelys, which is what this is, will always trigger first, which means if your opponent plays a feint on offense or something like surprise attack, which has a feint effect essentially that triggers immediately, this will always happen first before attacks, so you're never worried about this getting canceled. Now, I thought through like 3 or 4 possible scenarios for this card. Like maybe you draw out a regroup so that you don't take any damage if they played a big attack, or maybe you draw out a really big attack that requires some setup that maybe your opponent really wasn't ready for, like a Forever Hide. If the Jekyll player's hand is only like 4 cards, and you see that they only have 2 Jekyll cards in their hand, maybe you draw out the Forever Hide so that it deals some damage now as opposed to big damage later. But really the best use for this card is taking a feint away from your opponent, because then of course you can play a Beastform later in the game and have the effect without it getting canceled. And I really think that is probably the ideal use for this card, and if anything else happens, you're probably just like a little bit disappointed. Knowing what their hand is also nice. I think I said in my Sinbad video, because Sinbad has a voyage that lets you look at your opponent's hand, I think just looking at your opponent's hand and not doing anything with that information is kind of overrated, because if you know your opponent's deck, you generally have a good idea of what they're holding at all times. And unless you see like some specific scenario where they either have no attack cards in their hand or no block cards in your hand, on average, like if they have a good attack, a bad attack, a good block, and a bad block, like what really do you gain from that? You just know the possibilities for their mind game, but it doesn't really help you solve that. So I really think that hand knowledge gets better when you actually get to do something like that, especially forced discards. But this is pretty good too, because feint is probably the bane of your existence as a Dracula player, and taking one away from your opponent is really, really good. 3 value block cards aren't amazing, but they're pretty solid. Definitely better than... I think the difference between 2 and 3 value block cards is much, much bigger than the difference between 3 and 4 value block cards, if that makes sense. And just look at that art and please tell me what you see. This is probably one of the strongest block cards in all of Unmatched, and it's definitely the best block card in this deck. The next block card is Look Into My Eyes. Dracula, only 1 value block card with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. Don't know where that came from. Not happening again. It says during combat, add the boost value from your opponent's attack card to the defense value of this card. This is a really risky card because when you play it, you don't know what your opponent played, and therefore you have no idea what the ultimate value of this card will be, so you really don't know if it's a good decision or a bad decision. As I mentioned earlier, Dracula lacks block cards, and when you play this card, you're usually playing it because you have to and not because you're excited to. There's always some risk involved with a 1 value block card. There's like 4 or 5 in the game right now, and they're especially this card is very dependent on what your opponent plays, because there's a lot of good cards with low block value or low boost values, like Sinbad's Voyages. All don't have a boost value except for, I think, Voyage Home, which has a boost value of 1. And if it's late in the game against Sinbad and he's dealing 6 to 8 damage with his Voyages and you're blocking 1 to 2 of them, yikes. And some common cards like Skirmish and Leap Away only have a boost value of 1, so you're still taking 2 damage from that attack. It does scale decently against some of the better attacks in the game. Like, there's like 5 decks that have 5 value attacks with no text, and I think Buffy's Mr. Pointy has a boost value of 4, and the other ones have a boost value of 3. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. And cards like Larger Than Life and Excalibur have a boost value of 3. So you're still blocking 1 to 2 damage on some of the best attacks in the game. So that's decent, but there are a ton of really strong attacks that have low boost values, as I mentioned before. Like Ancient Heirloom, I'm pretty sure that only has a boost value of 1. And if your opponent has 3 rage and plays an 8 value Ancient Heirloom and you block 2 damage of it, that's half your health gone like that. If I could change this card, it definitely just would make it a value 2 instead of a value 1. But I could see how that would probably be too good of a card. But I don't think it's very strong as a value 1 attack, because it's a very high risk, low reward play in my opinion. But you have to play it because you don't really have any defensive options, and you're probably going to take at least 1 damage when you play this card. But yeah, it's just definitely not as good as Do My Bidding. The next card is Baptism of Blood, a Dracula only scheme with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. It says recover 2 health. Return a defeated sister to any space in Dracula's zone. Now, I fall into a trap a lot of times of directly comparing cards from one deck to cards in another deck, like Excalibur and Larger Than Life. Of course, the comparison there is very simple because they're basically the exact same card, but with different copy values and a different name. But you have to remember that cards don't exist in a vacuum. Cards exist as part of a deck. And so with that in mind, I think this card is not as good as some of the other Sidekick Revival tools in the game. But remember, it doesn't have to be because it's a part of Dracula's deck and not in a vacuum. So let's just take a step back and unpack that statement. If we look at Winged Frenzy from Medusa's deck, that lets you move all your fighters and then place the Harpy down, which gives you immediate impact on the board. It lets you make a tactical retreat or a tactical attack. Call for Backup from Muldoon's deck brings back all your defeated workers, not just one, and you can either draw cards or put down traps, which either lets you maintain or gain card advantage or pressures the board with your fighters. And Defenders of Sherwood from Robin Hood's deck, it's a defense card, so it doesn't cost you an action on your turn to play it. So if the sidekick is still alive by the time it gets back to your turn, which usually it will be, it's almost like you got it back for free because you didn't have to spend an action to play with. So when you compare that to this card recovers 2 health, which doesn't have any board impact at all. During the game, it doesn't matter if you're on 1 health or maximum health because you still function the same. Of course, health matters because that's how your opponent wins the game, by reducing your health dial to 0. But functionally, it doesn't really change like what's happening on the board, which you could be at max health, but based on what's happening with the board state and your cards in hand, like you could lose the game in 2 turns. It doesn't really matter. So I think this effect is pretty passive comparatively, but like when we take a step back from that, that logic is pretty flawed, and it's actually a pretty good card in this deck because recovering 2 health and then getting an additional effect is actually really strong. As I mentioned before, Dracula has a lot of healing, and just recovering 2 health is pretty good. There aren't that many healing cards in the game. Looking Glass from Alice's deck is like probably one of the best ones because it recovers 3 health all at once. And a Grimtail. I was like, I gotta remember this card. A Grimtail from Little Red's deck recovers 4 health all at once. Of course, it doesn't always do that. Sometimes it just recovers 2 health. And there are a bunch of cards like Calming Research in Jekyll and Hyde's deck that recovers 2 health. But there's also a bunch of cards that only recover 1 health. And 2 health is twice as good as 1 health, obviously. And I think that this card works just fine in this deck. It's a little like slow, kind of like passive. Like it doesn't really help with your momentum because this is like one of your actions on a turn. So rarely will you be able to like do anything with that sister unless like the positioning is perfect beforehand. You can't revive the sister, move them, and attack in the same turn. I hope this all makes sense. Just the key takeaway from this card is that it's pretty good. It's really good if you can chain it with Ravening Seduction, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But if you can revive your sister in a way that lets you use Ravening Seduction on the second action and then deal some damage to your opponent, I think that is a really good use of this card, and it kind of takes away from the criticism I have of it being like a low momentum move. The next card is Prey Upon, not to be confused with the card Prey Upon from the upcoming Mother Teresa deck, or the card Grey Upon from the upcoming Condiment deck. Those are not real cards. Anyways, Prey Upon is a Dracula-only scheme with a boost value of 4 and 2 copies. And it says, deal 1 damage to all opposing fighters adjacent to Dracula. Dracula recovers 1 health for each damage dealt. So this is an area of effect, or AoE card. And this is really good against enemies with multiple sidekicks, because if you can kill like at least 2 of them with this 1 card, I think that is a really, really good use and good efficient use of this card. This is kind of like a deterrent for trying to surround Dracula, because he can deal a bunch of damage and, more importantly, recover a ton of health if you put all your fighters around him. I literally just read a conversation in the Discord about why, as the Raptors, you don't really want to surround Dracula with all 3 of them, because the Prey Upon value is just too good for him. I was just like, wow, I'm about to sit down and talk about that. So it's really good for multiple sidekicks. And in most of your other matchups, there will only be 2 fighters on the board, your opponent and their sidekick. And I think the value is still really good if you can hit both of them, but I don't think your opponent, if they know you have this card and are actively playing around it, will give you that many situations to actually play it so that you can hit both of their fighters. Dealing 2 damage is a common scheme effect. There are a bunch of schemes that just deal 2 damage to someone. And as we just talked about, healing 2 health is like a rare, but like we've seen it before effect. But if you put both of them together, dealing 2 damage and recovering 2 health, that is very strong for a scheme card. Dealing 1 damage to 2 fighters for 2 damage total is, I think, worse than dealing 2 damage to 1 fighter in general. But I think if you can hit 2 targets with this, it's really good for a scheme. The problem is against solo heroes and just heroes that don't put their sidekick and their hero close to each other. Dealing 1 damage and recovering 1 health, I don't think it's that strong. And I think the main problem this card can have is that situation will probably be available to you more than the other better situation. So I think this card has a ton of potential and is really strong when it works. You just have to be patient and wait for that occurrence to present itself to you. Another like niche thing to point out is that discarding this card as a part of a non-lethal beast form is actually like worse than just playing it by itself, because if you discard it for Beastform, it only deals 1 damage. But if you just play it against one fighter, you deal 1 damage and recover a health, which like doesn't matter if you're just going to kill them with the Beastform anyway. And it's actually like faster to deal the damage as a part of the Beastform instead of spending an additional action to play this card. But you know, like that's just something interesting I thought I would point out. And the last Dracula card is Mistform. I really hope people are familiar with the game Fury of Dracula, otherwise this running gag makes no sense. Mistform is a Dracula scheme with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. It says, place Dracula in any space. Gain 1 action. Now, there are a couple cards I can think of in the game, mostly Looking Glass and Vanish, but I'm sure I'm missing one, that basically let you relocate your hero anywhere on the board. That in itself would be like a pretty good scheme, because that means no matter how far away your opponent was, you could move to them and then hit them as your turn. Except this gives you an additional action. And as you know from the last video, when I literally screamed during the Rolling Fog card, I love cards that give you actions because they're just really good. Doing 3 things on your turn is much better than doing 2 things on your turn. So this jumps back to the point I made about Dracula being a move 2 fighter. Doesn't matter that you're a move 2 fighter, because with 2 copies of Mistform, you are always scary. With a full hand and your opponent any distance away from you, you are potentially lethal for most of the game, which is one of the reasons why Dracula is so strong. Now, I mentioned I like using this first action so I can get next to my opponent and then hit them twice. If you were in a jam or pinned and like you didn't have any defense cards because you don't really have a lot, you could also use Mistform as a nice way to escape, and then with the additional action, draw a card. But for the most part, I like using this to set up the final form combo, which no one else on this planet calls it that, to then Mistform and Beastform. To Mistform them and then just use Beastform if you have a full hand. Now, I will mention that is very predictable. A lot of times, if an enemy Dracula Mistforms, I can pretty much assume that he's going to play Beastform after that. So you can actually switch things up. Maybe on your first Mistform, you throw in a bait attack and try to draw out a feint if you haven't gotten rid of them with ambushes or do my bidding yet. But like sometimes just playing Beastform will be better, and if their feints are already gone, yeah, Beastform's a pretty good choice. But just remember that it's very, very predictable if you do that. However, the whole act of actually Mistforming across the board is very unexpected for your opponent. I mean, they will expect it because they know the card exists, but the timing of your form attack, if you will always be unexpected. Just a really strong card. The fact that this exists in conjunction with Beastform is one of the reasons why Dracula is so strong, because he is lethal at any range, at any time, with a full hand. And now we're going to talk about the sisters, Dracula's sidekicks. I am a big fan of the one that faces left. You know, the one that faces right just looks kind of sad, and the one staring right at me into my soul, not gonna lie, kind of scares me. These are your early game damage dealers, because as you'll see, they have some strong options. The problem is, and this is like a problem for the whole deck, is that you don't block very well. And we saw how Do My Bidding and Look Into My Eyes are great, or like okay to pretty good block cards. The sisters don't really have options like that because they can't use Dracula specific cards. The best block card they have is Exploit, which is a 4 value block card, but they only have 2 copies of it, so that's like my go-to card to block for with the sisters. And they have Dash, which is a 3 value block card, and that's the same problem that Robin Hood's Outlaws have, is that the Outlaws have a ton of 3 value cards to block with, but the problem is usually that doesn't keep them alive after the combat. So the sisters' board staying power is pretty limited, especially with the fact that Baptism of Blood, their revival card, as I mentioned, like doesn't really give them a lot of momentum, so they're pretty vulnerable to just being picked off very quickly early in the game, which sucks because cards like Feeding Frenzy rely on the strength in numbers aspects. Once your opponent realizes the vulnerability of your sisters, they're probably just going to try to kill them right away first every game, which it kind of sucks because you really need them all alive. If there's only one alive, it's just kind of useless. Anyways, let's see why the sisters are so strong with Thirst for Sustenance, the sister-only attack. It is a value 3 with a boost value 3 and 3 copies. A lot of 3s there. It says, after combat, if you won the combat, place Dracula in any space adjacent to the opposing fighter. Now notice how it doesn't say you may place Dracula in any space like some other cards would. This states if you won the combat, you must do this, which is place Dracula next to the opposing fighter, which might be bad if Dracula's low on health, because you just put him right down the scope of your enemy's sniper rifle, and you might just die next turn if you don't have any block cards. So like, don't play this as like a desperation attack if you're trying to win the game if you don't have any block cards in your hand, because you put Dracula right next to your opponent if you win the combat. It is, however, if you are prepared for the effect to work, which if you're going to play this card, you should always be ready for the effect to potentially work, is that it sets up surprise pins, because, oh, what do you know? Dracula just showed up right behind your opponent, and there's a sister or two next to him, and now the opponent's surrounded, and oh boy, it's going to be a fun ride from here. And there's 3 copies of this, so it's a pretty common attack for you in the deck. And while the effect is potentially powerful, it's very hard to actually use because it's a 3-value attack, and the effect depends on you winning the combat. A lot of cards in this game that block at least 3 damage, if not 4. And most of the time, cards that are 2-value and block are feint. And if this card gets feinted, the effect doesn't happen. Very rarely, in the case of like Willow or Little Red, will there be 2-value block cards that don't cancel your effect and that this will actually beat. It's the same problem that Beowulf has with his card No Contest Expecteth, which can instantly kill a sidekick for 3 rage if you win the combat with a 3-value attack. But the problem is, most of the time, your enemy won't let you do that. I think, though, this card actually like makes your opponent have to play a good block card, because the threat of Dracula and a sister pinning your opponent is pretty strong because of Dracula's ability. So, like, whenever a sister attacks, they kind of have to play a good block card. And it's actually really good if this gets feinted, because you'd rather any attack in your deck get feinted except for Beastform. And getting a good block or a feint out of your opponent is good. And if that's all this card does, you can live with that. You have 3 copies of it too. So it's basically a bait card that is actually not a pair in this deck, which is great. So while I think the card is bad because you don't get like the immediate effect on it as much as you might want, it's good in the long run because it gets a good block card or a feint out of your opponent's hand. And the next card is Ravening Seduction, not Ravening. It's a sister-only scheme with a boost value of 2, and you have 3 copies of it. It says move any fighter up to 2 spaces. After moving, deal 1 damage to the moved fighter for each sister adjacent to them. Now, you can move any fighter, but why would you move Dracula instead of just maneuvering? And why would you move a sister with this card? Like, just move your opponent. It's that simple. So this requires some careful positioning and setup, which can be pretty obvious to your opponent, but sometimes, especially on maps like Baskerville Manor, which this fighter is a part of the set that contains that map, you can move people through secret passages or fog and really surprise them with a nice 3 damage. This can deal anywhere from 3, 2, or 1 damage, or 0 if you just don't move them next to a sister. And if this deals 3 damage, it is really, really good. If you remember in the Invisible Man video, how Step Lightly, I believe, deals 3 damage as a scheme, but then has a drawback. This doesn't really have a direct drawback, but we'll come back to that. And I think if you can deal 2 damage with this scheme, it's still pretty good. 1 damage, just like Prey Upon, is kind of underwhelming. And this is the main reason why you want to keep your sisters alive and you want to keep them all alive, because a 3 damage Ravening Seduction is really scary. Mostly because this is like a really good card to just reduce your opponent's health total in the early game so that you can hit them with a big Beastform later in the game. And it has the same problem as Feeding Frenzy, where if you draw it late in the game when you don't have any sisters, it just kind of sucks. But the good thing about both of these sister cards is that they make for great Beastform fodder if all of your sisters are dead, because it's better as 1 damage in a Beastform than sitting in your hand unplayable. The problem with this card is that it just directly puts your sisters in danger because you move a fighter next to all of them. And if that fighter has AoE, you might have just dealt 3 damage, but you also might have lost the game if they can just kill all 3 of your sidekicks in like 1 or 2 turns. It might be good if you can play this first action and then maneuver away with your sisters and maybe spread them out. But a lot of times you might have to use your first action on a turn to maneuver your sisters in a position to then play Ravening Seduction. So it requires some deck knowledge to know if your opponent has a 1 damage AoE effect like Savagery or that one Wigloff card, but it's also good for setting up pins, just like there's For Sustenance is, which is one of the reasons why the sisters are good, because they let Dracula use his ability if you can prevent your opponent from moving. And this can move fighters into pins that they didn't think they were available to be in, because a lot of times you aren't really expecting your opponent's card to move you. It's one of the reasons why Command the Storm is so good from King Arthur's deck. It also activates defensive momentous shifts, which is just something to be aware of. If you watched my over-explained gameplay video with Robin Hood and Bigfoot, you'll know that a defensive momentous shift activation caught me very off guard, because it's just not really something you see every day, so you don't really expect it. You don't really include it in your calculation of possibilities, but this card would activate it if your opponent has it. Overall, this is like the 2nd or 3rd best card in your deck. Probably 3rd, because Do My Bidding is just really good at removing feints. But this is the main damage dealer you have besides Beastform, and it's really good if you can make good use of it early in the game. The first any card we have is Ambush, a 2-value attack with a boost value of 3 and 2 copies. It says, during combat, your opponent discards 1 random card. Add its boost value to this card's attack. So this is a card we've seen already. It's in a few decks like Robin Hood, the Raptors, and it's called Stones in the Belly, I believe, in Little Red's deck, although it's basically the same as an ambush, just with a basket symbol requirement. This is the one attack that you don't want to bait. Basically, every other attack in this deck is kind of like a bait for Beastform, but you don't want this to get canceled because random discards are really powerful effects. In an ideal world, this would get rid of 1 feint, and both copies of Do My Bidding would get rid of the other 2 feints. This won't always get rid of feints, but that's okay. I say normally ambushes end up being 4-value attacks because they get rid of cards with 2 values, but that's just me saying like, oh, some cards have 1 value, some cards have 2 value, some cards have 3 value. Put them all together, that's an average of 2. I have no idea what the average boost value of all the cards in the game is, much less of each specific fighter, but I say in general it will probably be 2, and I have no data to back that up. So if someone would like to correct me on that, feel free. I'm not taking ownership of that stat. I'm just pretending like it's real. Another way to use this card potentially, because you don't want to use this necessarily as Dracula for a fear of your opponent thinking it's a Beastform and then fainting it, you could use this as a sister, because the other attack options the sisters have, like in the long run, aren't very good for your opponent to feint. Like, do they really want to feint Thirst for Sustenance or a dash? So playing this as a sister is a pretty good option to just get like a value blocker like Skirmish out of the way. But if they feint this, like, it sucks, but it's still a win for you because, as I said before, every attack in your deck is a bait for Beastform, and this is probably like the 2nd best attack in your deck. The next card is Exploit, a versatile 4 with a boost value of 1 and 2 copies. It says, after combat, draw 1 card. This card is also seen in Sinbad's deck, and I believe it's just a really solid card. This is the one card in Dracula's deck, that actually draws a card besides his ability. Your card draw is so scarce because Dracula with Robin Hood's card draw would be insane because your beast forms would be maxed out every single time, and it would just be really easy for you to get them. Dracula, of course, has to spend a lot of his actions just maneuvering for cards, but this is pretty good because it replaces itself, so your hand size doesn't go down after you play it. As I said before, this is the best card for you to use as a block card for your sisters because it's the highest value card in the game that the sisters can, not in the game, in your deck that the sisters can use. And a 4 value block card will keep them alive most of the time unless your opponent has a 5 value attack or after combat damage effects. But it's the most consistent value blocker in the deck that the sisters can use because Look Into My Eyes might block 4 damage, but the sisters cannot use it. This is probably one of the best cards in your deck to draw out a feint with because it still deals 2 damage, and the effect isn't devastating if you don't get it, like ambush. Like, you really want ambush to go through. If this card gets feinted, it's like, all right, I'm down a card, and you can live with that. So maybe on your first Mistform, you play Exploit and draw out a feint or something like that. Otherwise, just save it as a block card for your sisters. And the next card is Dash, a 3 value versatile with a boost value of 1 and 3 copies. It says, after combat, move your fighter up to 3 spaces. This card is also found in Medusa's deck. And this functions better as an attack, but in practice will probably be a defense card a lot of the time. As an attack, it lets you kite with advantage because you get to move after combat and make your opponent maneuver first action to attack you if they're melee. And it's also a good bait for feints because this isn't really a good card, I guess. Like, just like with Exploit, it's not as good as something like Ambush. So you'd much rather have this get canceled than something like an Ambush and especially Beastform. But you don't have a lot of block options in this deck. So most of the time your versatiles will have to be used on defense. And this is what you use. I don't know if it's worth using as a sister for the same problem that the Outlaws have in Robin Hood's deck, where 3 value block cards don't really keep them alive. But for Dracula, yeah, saving 3 points of damage is pretty good. And against ranged fighters, you could move if you play this on defense. You can move when it's not your turn, which, as I've stressed in past videos, I think is a really valuable effect because then at the start of your turn, you have really good positioning. And potentially, you could move Dracula right next to that ranged fighter and hit them with your ability for maybe the first or second time that game, because hitting it on ranged fighters is really hard. Yeah, it's a okay card. Nothing too flashy, nothing too special, but it gets the job done probably. It's a good defense card for Dracula, not so much the sisters. And the basic cards, all right, that's the last time a Fury of Dracula card shows up in this video. Hopefully. This running gag probably wasn't very funny. Feint in this deck is reserved solely for canceling out your opponent's best effect on defense as Dracula probably. There's no point in using it as a sister because they'll probably die anyways. It's time for final thoughts. And Dracula, while I think he is pretty inconsistent and has some glaring issues, he also has one of the strongest attacks in the game and one of the best finishing combos of the game in terms of the final form combo that is really just Mistform, Beastform, maybe another Beastform. And because of that, he can kill a lot of people from like 75% of their health total. And if you can do that, you're probably going to win more games than you would have otherwise. And I see people constantly rank Dracula among the top 5, maybe even 6 fighters in Unmatched. And I agree with that because Beastform is so strong, and being able to hit it from anywhere, not like anywhere, but like being able to use it at any time because you can literally just teleport next to your opponent with Mistform. That combo is very, very strong. And likewise, Dracula's pretty strong too. The deck composition deep dive that we did earlier, I think is probably one of the most interesting things I've ever pointed out on this channel, because his deck contradicts itself. You have the block cards of an aggressive deck, but the attack cards of a slow deck. And I just think in seeing it in practice, like, is just so cool, because you're really not aggressive, nor are you slow. You just kind of wait for your Beastform, and then that just like determines the pace you have to play at. And that's just kind of cool, because like you really, like, you can't really go into the game being like, yeah, I'm gonna be like super aggressive against this guy, because sometimes you don't draw your good attacks. And like, I guess that you could say that about any unmatched hero, but Dracula really just depends on when you draw his beast forms, and there really isn't like a aggressive, slow like category that he falls into. Because sure, I think being slow is better if your opponent lets you do that, because if you just run away, maneuver all game, and just constantly have a full hand, you can lay down some pretty big smites. But most of the time, your opponent probably should be pretty aggressive, especially early game against your sisters, and that will kind of ruin your plans, because every card that you spend blocking is one less card that you can't pump into Beastform. I don't know. I just think this character is super interesting to me. That the deck composition section definitely like baffling to me, but like I completely understand it at the same time. And maybe that doesn't make any sense for you, but like it's just cool. I'm geeking out over this right now, and it's time to end the video. Thank you so much for watching. I know it's been like a month and like 2 weeks since I last posted the video. And the truth about that is I graduated college at the beginning of May, and the last couple weeks of school were absolute hell. If you know anyone in school right now, COVID university with all their classes online, it's just like it's not the same as normal school. It's not as good as normal school by a lot. And it's just not very fun. And I've had some problems with mental health in the past, and this last semester of school definitely made everything worse with the stress level, and just like the fact that school was just completely not what it was supposed to be in my mind. So YouTube has always been a great outlet for me to just put a bunch of time and energy into, and it's super rewarding. I'm super appreciative of all the people that support my channel, but like their subscriptions and their comments. Like, I love the community that I've garnered, and especially the Unmatched community in general. Like, reading that Discord every day, it like gives me life, bro. But you know, sometimes just existing is hard, and posting YouTube videos is even harder. A lot of work went into this one, and sometimes there were some days where I would just like sit down to work on this, and I was just, after 5 minutes, I was like, oh god, I just can't do that. So sorry that it's late. Hopefully you understand, and I will try to get back on a more consistent schedule this summer. Long video. So anyways, yeah, that's it. Like, subscribe, yeet. The yeeting is mandatory, the other two are not. All right, that's it. Yeet.